Hi, I'm Elara. On what should have been the happiest night of my life, my fiancé was planning to poison me with peanuts to steal $95 million, and the people who should have protected me? They smiled, raised their glasses, and laughed. Except for one person. My grandmother heard everything, and when she opened that ballroom door, the whole night shattered. But tell me something. If your own family stood by while someone tried to kill you for money, would you still call them family? Let's start from the beginning. I used to think weddings were magical, that the room would fill with love, not expectations. But standing in that ballroom, beneath the chandeliers dripping with crystals, all I felt was pressure tightening around my chest like a corset pulled too tight. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I entered the hall. Everyone turned to look, but no one really saw me. Not as a person. Just a bride in a beautiful dress, an accessory to $1 million event. The room buzzed with conversation, not one word about love or new beginnings. Only talk of investments, name-dropping, and gossip disguised as compliments. "She landed well," someone whispered. "He's a smart man, knows how to pick a family." Dorian was smiling near the bar, sleeves rolled up just enough to look relaxed, but calculated. He didn't see me right away. He was too busy chatting with my father, their heads bent in what looked more like a business merger than a family union. I moved to find my seat. My name wasn't at the main table. That had to be a mistake. My eyes scanned once, twice. I finally found it, tucked awkwardly at a side table, right by the catering door. I blinked, heart skipping. No one said a word, but I saw it. The smirk from my sister, the downward glance from my cousin. Someone whispered, and another stifled a laugh. I stood there, frozen for half a second. Then I smiled, as if nothing was wrong, and took my seat. My dress rustled against the folding chair. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my back straight. Across the room, Grandmother Rowena caught my eye. Her expression didn't change, but her gaze sharpened. She knew. She always knew. She didn't have to say anything. Her silence was her shield, and tonight, it wrapped around me like armor. I held on to that glance like a child clutching a security blanket. If she was watching, maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. Dinner passed in a blur. Champagne flutes clinked. Laughter rose and fell. My mother's pearls gleamed under the soft lights. My father made a speech that sounded more like a resume. I laughed where I should, smiled when prompted. My cheeks ached from pretending. Then Dorian stood. He raised his glass, arm draped lightly around my shoulders. His voice, smooth as always, carried through the hall. "To my beautiful bride, Elara," he began, his words soaked in charm. "She's stunning, isn't she? I mean, let's be honest. She may not know much about business, but damn, she sure knows how to smile." Laughter exploded. Real laughter. Loud, unfiltered. My body didn't move, but something inside me recoiled like a spring snapping loose. My hands stayed in my lap. My face, unchanged. But I felt heat crawl up my neck, shame burning beneath the layers of silk and lace. I smiled again, nodded like it was funny, like I didn't hear the jab laced in honey. Grandmother Rowena was no longer watching from across the room. She was gone. Vanished. My stomach tightened, unsure if her absence meant something more. Dorian leaned in, kissed my temple like a performer ending his act, then turned to clink glasses with the next guest. My champagne stayed untouched. I tried not to think too much. Told myself it was just a joke. He didn't mean it. It was nerves, stress, the spotlight. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't new. This was just the first time the world saw it. I took a slow breath, focusing on the music, the light, the way the candles flickered against the mirrored centerpieces. I pretended not to see the sidelong glances or hear the half-jokes that followed his. A younger version of me would have cried in the bathroom. But I'd learned tears don't fix anything, especially when no one believes they're real. Instead, I sat quietly. I stared at the ring on my finger, sparkling, expensive, heavy. I tried to ignore the sting in his words, but then something even more unsettling caught my attention. I blinked, trying to steady myself. The sting of Dorian's joke still hummed in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I shifted in my seat, feeling suddenly exposed, like every pair of eyes in the room had seen more than just my smile. They'd seen the crack beneath it. I needed air. Pushing my chair back quietly, I slipped away from the table. No one stopped me. No one even noticed. Not Dorian, not my sister, not even my father. I walked slowly, like I had all the time in the world, though my heart was racing like it was late for something. The hallway just outside the ballroom was dimmer, quieter. The music softened behind the walls, dulled by distance and architecture. The change in temperature was immediate, cooler, calmer. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't want to cry. I wasn't going to. I ran my fingers along the edge of a marble column, grounding myself. In that moment, all I wanted was to collect myself, maybe splash some water on my face and go back before anyone noticed I was missing. But something stopped me. A sound. Not footsteps, not laughter. Voices. I turned toward a hallway near the catering entrance, one I knew led to a service corridor where vendors and staff stored supplies. A door was cracked open just slightly, enough to let a sliver of light fall across the carpet. I moved closer, quiet on my feet. Then I heard him. "Once it's done, she won't be able to stop me from taking it all. 95 million. And every asset will be mine." The voice was unmistakable. Dorian. My legs turned to concrete. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe I misheard, that he was talking about someone else, that I was letting my emotions play tricks on me. But then another voice joined him. Low, gruff, familiar. My father. "She signed the prenup." "You made sure of that, right?" Dorian let out a short laugh, sharp, smug. "She thinks it's just paperwork. But once we file after the transfer, everything's locked. She won't know what hit her." I felt my entire body tighten. Blood drained from my face. I had to press my hand to the wall just to stay upright. They were planning something. Together. My fiancé, my father. The two men I had spent my life trying to earn respect from, now plotting behind closed doors to strip me of everything. And the worst part? The calm in their voices. No guilt, no hesitation, just cold precision. I leaned back slightly, heart pounding. I didn't know how long I stood there before I noticed movement to my left. Rowena. My grandmother had appeared silently, like a shadow rising from memory. She stood just a few feet away, her eyes locked onto mine. From the look on her face, I knew she'd heard it too. Not all of it, but enough. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We stared at each other for a moment that stretched too long. A silent exchange passed between us. Fear, betrayal, and something sharper. Clarity. Then she slowly walked past me, her hand brushing mine just for a second. A touch that said, "We're not alone in this." I watched her disappear into another hallway. I stood there, torn. I could walk into that room, confront them, demand answers, rip this entire charade apart in front of every guest. But something held me back. Not fear, though that was there too. It was the memory of all the times I spoke up and was told I was too emotional, overthinking, or making things awkward. The years of being dismissed, laughed at, told I was lucky Dorian tolerated how quiet I was. So I stood still. I needed proof. I needed more. I needed to outsmart them, not just react. I turned and walked away from the door. each step heavier than the last. I didn't go back into the ballroom. I found a side hallway, leaned against a wall, and just stood. For the first time in my life, silence wasn't comfort. I thought silence would buy me time, but that silence became the heaviest weight I had ever carried. It took everything in me to walk back into that reception hall with my head high. The crowd was still buzzing, waiters sliding between tables with trays of lamb and rosemary chicken. Glasses clinked. My dress still shimmered, and no one knew that my life had just cracked under my heels like cheap porcelain. I eased back into my seat, folding my hands neatly in my lap, smiled, nodded when a guest raised their glass toward me, thanked the couple from my father's country club for coming. The whole thing was mechanical, like I'd been rehearsing it for years. But inside, I was somewhere else. I kept hearing Dorian's voice, flat and cold behind that door. 95 million. All mine. I tried to sip water. It tasted like metal. The music in the background was now a dull hum, words around me muffled. Everything else faded behind the drumbeat in my head. I stared at the silverware. For some reason, the forks reminded me of a Thanksgiving when I was 8, back when Mom still used real tablecloths and not catered setups. I had spent the whole morning setting the table, folding the napkins, lining up the utensils, placing little name cards I wrote by hand. But when dinner started, my sister Layla walked in late, holding a store-bought pie. Everyone clapped. "Look at her," Dad said. "Always the one who brings something to the table." I remember sitting there, staring at the candles I had placed, the settings I had polished. No one noticed. I felt that same invisible ache now. Same table. Same feeling. Different dress. A laugh broke through the noise. Dorian again, laughing too hard at something my father said. The way he leaned in, touched his shoulder, like they were frat brothers closing a deal. If I hadn't heard what I heard, I might have thought it was just harmless bonding. But I had. I forced myself to breathe, to look around without looking panicked. That's when I felt it. A gentle squeeze under the table. Rowena. Her hand found mine like it had so many times when I was a child and needed stillness. She didn't look at me directly, just leaned slightly closer and said, barely above a whisper, "You see them clearly now." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And in that moment, I did. I saw everything, the subtle manipulation, the history of being sidelined, the slow erosion of my own voice. This wedding wasn't the beginning of a new chapter. It was the climax of a long play where I'd been cast as the silent supporting role in my own life. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to drag them all onto that stage of chandeliers and say, look what you've done to me." But I didn't. I sat still, because Rowena was right. Seeing clearly was one thing. Acting too fast could cost everything. I needed to be smart now. At that moment, Dorian stood, tapping his spoon against his glass with theatrical flair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, flashing that grin I now recognized as nothing but performance. "Later tonight, I have a little surprise toast prepared for my beautiful bride. A moment of reflection and revelation." The room responded with polite laughter, glasses raised in anticipation. He looked right at me, not through me, at me, like he knew I knew something, and he wanted me to feel helpless watching it unfold. That smile wasn't for the guests. It was for me. And I understood then that this was just the beginning of the game he thought he'd already won. I braced myself, knowing the toast he prepared wasn't meant to honor me. It was meant to break me. The clinking of glassware followed his announcement. I felt my spine stiffen, hands clenched gently in my lap, fingers locked in a slow, calculated grip. Around me, people leaned forward with warm anticipation. I forced a soft smile, the kind you offer a stranger on the street when you're too tired to explain the storm brewing inside. Dorian adjusted his tie and stepped toward the stage, the spotlight softening as it shifted with him. The band lowered their melody to a hush, and even the kids running near the dessert table were shushed by a well-meaning aunt. The room quieted. He looked perfect, polished, confident, the kind of man people dream their daughters marry. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, lifting a flute of champagne, "tonight, I married not just a beautiful woman, but a woman with a heart so big she makes everyone around her better just by existing." A gentle chorus of awes floated from a few tables. I kept my smile in place, but something in me tugged. The warmth of those words didn't reach his eyes. He went on, pacing himself like he'd rehearsed this more than once. "Elara has taught me patience, compassion, and how to put ketchup on eggs. Still not sure I've forgiven her for that one." Laughter rolled in, polite and easy. Then his tone shifted, just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't tuned into every syllable like I was. "But let's be real. My bride may have the biggest heart in the room, but when it comes to numbers—" He paused, letting the silence fill with smirks. "Let's just say, thank God for online banking." The room broke into laughter. Some folks even clapped. Dorian grinned as if he'd just delivered a harmless sitcom punchline. I didn't move, didn't blink. My face, frozen in polite composure, burned. Inside, it felt like someone had yanked the floor out from under me, and I was falling fast. The insult wasn't new. He'd joked like that before, in private. Usually, I let it roll off. But here, now, in front of everyone I knew and half I didn't, he wasn't just mocking me. He was planting an image, one where I was foolish, dependent, the pretty bride who couldn't count past 10 without a calculator. I turned slightly, scanning the crowd. My father laughed too loud, slapping Dorian's back from across the table, like it was the best joke of the night. My brother chuckled with that familiar eye roll that always meant, "Elara won't mind." But I did. I minded a lot. Dorian leaned forward, soaking in the adoration. "Let's hope she never has to balance a checkbook, folks. Lord knows I'm keeping the safe locked." More laughter. One woman whispered to her husband, "She's lucky he's patient." Lucky. The bile in my throat rose, but I swallowed it with the last of my champagne. It was either that or stand up and scream, and I wasn't ready to give him that satisfaction. I looked down at my ring. The weight of it sat on my finger like a shackle. Then I felt her hand again. Rowena. She didn't say a word, but her eyes locked with mine from across the table. Not sad, not soft, sharp, unflinching. It was the look she used to give my grandfather when he talked down to her in public, the same look that once made a neighbor walk off our porch mid-argument. Her gaze held me up. Quiet strength, passed between generations without a single sound. Dorian raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said slowly, "and a future where nothing holds us back." His smile widened at the end of that sentence, but his tone dropped. Barely. Enough that I caught the edge in it. The challenge. The claim. Nothing holds us back. That wasn't a toast. It was a warning. The room applauded, but all I could hear was the echo of his threat beneath the laughter. The room erupted into applause. Forks tapped against champagne flutes, napkins waved gently in the air, and someone even whistled like it was a stand-up show. I didn't move, not right away. I sat there, spine perfectly upright, a porcelain smile painted onto my face. Inside, everything felt disconnected, like I was watching it all from somewhere outside my body. My heart wasn't pounding anymore. It had slowed to something dull and heavy, like it couldn't keep up with the humiliation. I heard people congratulating Dorian, clinking glasses in his direction. I caught the tail end of someone saying, "He's got jokes, huh?" As if this night were meant for his performance. All I wanted was air. I stood up, carefully, slowly. My chair scraped lightly against the floor, but no one noticed. Not even my sister, who was too busy laughing with a cousin over something I didn't care to hear. I moved toward the hallway, toward the powder room. Not a soul stopped me. Once inside, I locked the door behind me. The lights were too bright, too unforgiving. I walked to the sink and stared into the mirror. The woman looking back didn't feel like me. The makeup was still flawless, somehow. The dress I had imagined since I was 15, hugged me like a question I no longer wanted to answer. My eyes looked tired, hollow. I tilted my head slightly, like I was studying a stranger. I had imagined this night 1,000 different ways. None of them looked like this. My reflection didn't blink. And then, softly, so low it nearly didn't exist, I whispered to it, "Maybe this is my fault." And that broke me more than his words ever could. Because part of me believed it. I had seen it coming. Not clearly, not like a neon sign, but in the way Dorian interrupted me when I spoke, how he made decisions without asking, how he laughed when I brought up concerns and said I worried too much. I'd seen the smirk my father gave him when they spoke in hushed tones. I'd seen how my suggestions were brushed off, how my opinions were sweet but emotional. I just didn't want to fight. I didn't want to rock the boat. I told myself peace was better than being right. And here I was, the bride everyone looked at, but no one truly saw. There was a knock on the door. Soft. I didn't respond. A moment later, it opened slowly. Only one person in this family would ignore a locked door and walk in anyway. Rowena. She said nothing at first. Just stood there, then quietly closed the door behind her. Her shoes made the faintest sound against the tile as she walked to the vanity. She pulled a small linen napkin from her clutch. Embroidered in the corner, in delicate blue thread, was a single letter. E. She handed it to me. No fanfare, no speech. "You decide what this night will mean," she said. "That's all." Then she stepped back and leaned lightly against the counter, arms crossed, watching me the way a mother hawk watches the edge of a nest. I took the napkin and held it like it was breakable. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt. God, I was hurt. But because something in me was shifting. A quiet click in the back of my mind, like a key sliding into place. This pain. It wasn't new. It was just louder now. I remembered setting the Thanksgiving table all by myself when I was 11. My sister had walked in at the last second, tossed a few spoons into a caddy, and my dad beamed at her like she'd solved world hunger. I remembered the time my brother got promoted after using the sales deck I built, and no one mentioned my name. I remembered Dorian saying, "You're lucky I know how to handle finances," like I was a stray he'd rescued. This wasn't the first time I'd been invisible. It was just the first time I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. Maybe silence had always been my way of surviving. But tonight it felt different. Tonight, silence wasn't shielding me. It was sharpening something inside me. I looked at my reflection again. My face hadn't changed, but my eyes had. They weren't hollow anymore. They were watching. Waiting. If silence was going to be my armor, then I'd use it differently. Not to hide, not to appease, but to prepare. I folded the napkin once and slipped it into my wrist clutch. Then I turned to Rowena. She didn't say another word. She just gave me a look that said she knew. I stepped out of the powder room and into the hallway. The laughter had mellowed, replaced by the soft hum of a jazz saxophone and the clatter of dessert being served. I walked back into the ballroom with a smile so still it frightened even me. I passed the line of servers carrying dessert platters, crème brûlée, fruit tarts, miniature cheesecakes, weaving through tables where guests were patting shoulders, telling stories, taking pictures. My dress rustled softly. Every step toward my seat felt like walking deeper into a trap I couldn't yet name. I slid into my chair. The laughter still hung in the air, a hum just beneath the speakers, mingling with the clink of cutlery and soft murmur of background music. No one noticed my hands were shaking. My chest felt tight, as though someone had wrapped it in wire. I took a breath, quieting myself. Dorian leaned over to someone at the table next to mine, a mutual friend of my father's, and made a remark loud enough for nearby ears. "Oh, She cried over the contracts we didn't even sign yet, claiming she didn't understand them, he said, voice casual. Laughter followed, a sharp burst that cut through me. I bit my lip. Heat flushed my cheeks. Had I misheard? No. I had heard. I didn't excuse myself. I didn't run. I looked straight at him. Funny, I said, my voice calm but firm. I don't remember you signing that deed. The laughter around me faded, replaced by a ripple of surprise and awkward glances. Dorian's smirk faltered, just for a moment. His eyebrow twitched. My father cleared his throat, trying to redirect the room. You know Ilara's always been sensitive, he said, leaning in to pat Dorian on the shoulder. His tone was meant to soothe, but I felt a spark of humiliation flare hotter than before. Being called sensitive again was like being told you're fragile. Again. So you give even less room to breathe. Under the table, Rowena's hand rested lightly on mine. I couldn't see her face, but I felt the firmness in her grip. It was like a tether to the real world, a reminder that I wasn't alone. My breath caught. I realized I'd held it for too long. The sound of silverware clinking startled me, brought me back. Around me, guests paused. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Some stared. Dorian's eyes narrowed for a half-second before he replaced his smile. Then the toast began. A hush fell. Dorian raised his glass, his smile polished, elegant. To my future, he said, raises his voice so all can hear. A life where we all do exactly what we want, and no one questions what I provide. I watched him. His eyes were shining. Why, I wasn't sure. Pride? Arrogance? Something in the room shifted. It felt like air thinning. I realized that my patience, which I thought was strong, was finally fraying. I had spent a lifetime swallowing my words so others could feel comfortable. Tonight they tasted like poison, and I was done drinking. A guest lifted a flute of champagne toward me. I nodded, but didn't raise mine, didn't want to toast to his empty promises. I stared out over the room, hundreds of faces lit by soft light. I saw sincerity in some, the waitstaff, the aunt who smiled too kindly, the older couple at my table whose eyes rested on me with concern rather than spectacle. I realized that tonight, every person watching had a choice, to see what was happening or close their eyes. And though my voice was trembling inside, I realized silence could have its power. If I spoke up, I might unravel everything. They might accuse me of being dramatic or oversensitive, but if I stayed silent, I would lose more than I ever thought possible. I straightened in my chair, a decision anchored in a quiet, growing strength in my chest. I wouldn't shout. This wasn't the time for rage. Not yet. I let the quiet linger where his insult fell, letting every stifled chuckle and sideways glance sink in. I let people feel the discomfort they'd helped build, because sometimes the sharpest weapon is patience. The longest silence holds the loudest truth. Guests resumed their chatter. Dessert trays were passed, servers offered coffee, conversations restarted, but somewhere in the pause, something had changed. Dorian's voice seemed less assured, my father's laughter less full. I leaned forward slightly to my grandmother. She nodded once, her look saying, I see you. I believe you. And though the world around me expected applause and cheers, all I needed was to stay steady. I thought he would back down. But instead, Dorian struck harder. And this time, it wasn't just words. I barely had time to register the shift in the room before the crash echoed through the ballroom. Dorian's champagne flute hit the table and exploded, glass spraying across the white linen like it had been waiting all night to burst. The sound silenced everything. No more clinking glasses, no more soft jazz from the speakers, just gasps, one scream, then hush. I didn't flinch, but inside, something shattered too. He was still standing, hand clenched, chest rising like a man who hadn't gotten the reaction he expected. His face, so carefully composed all evening, now bore no smile. Just that hard, cold expression I'd seen in shadows and behind closed doors. Now it was out in the open. Guests stared. Some whispered. Some just watched in frozen disbelief, afraid to move. Dorian leaned in, close enough that I felt the heat of his breath on my cheek, but he didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His words were sharp enough. "You should have kept quiet," he hissed. "You just made your biggest mistake." He pulled back, eyes scanning the room like he realized too late that people had heard. Too many. And they weren't applauding this time. From across the table, I saw a woman I didn't even recognize, one of my mother's friends, maybe, put down her fork, her lips tight. Two men near the bar stopped mid-conversation. Even the photographer hesitated, lowering his camera. My father stood up in a rush, chuckling too loudly, arms out like he could gather the moment back together. "He's just overexcited," he said. "Too much champagne and nerves. You know how weddings are." No one laughed. I didn't speak. I didn't have to, because everyone had seen what I'd been trying to hide, or maybe what they hadn't wanted to see. Dorian rubbed his palm, probably a small nick from the broken glass, and flashed that practiced smile. "Sorry about the glass," he said, voice smooth again. "Guess I don't know my own strength." But the mask was cracked. People weren't smiling back the same way. The charm wasn't landing. I stood, slowly, deliberately, not to run, not to cry, just to be seen. And for once I didn't feel the urge to apologize for being uncomfortable or make anyone feel better about what they'd just witnessed. I didn't try to explain his outburst away. I met his eyes. He expected fear, submission, maybe shame. What he didn't expect was stillness. That kind of calm that comes when everything inside you finally stops spinning. Not because it's okay, but because you're done pretending. He stepped closer. "You're not going to walk away from this." "No," I said, just loud enough. "I'm not. I'm going to walk right through it." There was a beat of silence. He blinked, like he hadn't understood me. But I think he did. Everyone did. My father's face tightened, his eyes darting between us and the guests who were no longer pretending to eat. They were watching a show that had taken a sharp, uncomfortable turn. "You're making a scene," he muttered from behind me. "No," I said, not turning to him. He did. I could feel it building, the shift. Not a roar, not a tantrum, something steadier, like a tide that had turned. I'd spent my life trying not to embarrass anyone. Tonight, I realized they'd never cared about embarrassing me. And somehow, that realization didn't destroy me. It steadied me. Dorian reached for a new glass, trying to salvage the mood. "Let's toast again," he said too brightly. "To forgiveness, But the sparkle in his voice didn't match the look in his eyes. That shine had turned to something darker, cornered pride. He raised his glass, but this time, not everyone followed. Some stayed seated. Some sipped water instead. And me? I didn't lift a thing, because I wasn't part of his story anymore. The room held its breath. Even the air felt suspended. And that was when the door swung open, revealing the one person he hadn't counted on hearing everything. She walked in like the ballroom belonged to her, not slowly, not timidly. Grandmother Rowena moved through the stunned crowd with the kind of authority that made people stand without realizing they were doing it. Her gray hair was pinned back, the embroidery on her shawl catching the light like silver thread. Every step she took echoed louder than the music ever had. She didn't need a microphone. "I heard everything behind that door." That one sentence cut through the room like a blade. No one moved, not even Dorian. She stopped beside me at the center of the room, her hand brushing mine just enough for me to feel it tremble, only for a second, before she turned to face the crowd. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight," she continued. "I'd hoped my silence might preserve some dignity for this family. But dignity is already gone when you try to poison your own bride. A murmur rippled across the hall like wind through trees. Someone near the back gasped audibly. Glasses clinked. A fork dropped. I didn't breathe. Rowena's voice didn't rise, but it rang clear. He planned to serve her peanuts, knowing she's severely allergic. That's how he meant to get her out of the way. Quietly, permanently, and inherit everything. I could see it in the faces now. Guests who had laughed with Dorian an hour ago, whose eyes now darted between him and me with unease and disbelief. Some already believed her. Some wanted not to. But no one looked comfortable anymore. I'd always imagined justice as loud and dramatic. But this was quiet, still, and more powerful than anything I could have said myself. Dorian didn't let the silence last. He stepped forward, too quickly. "This is insane," he barked, his voice breaking the tension like shattering glass. "She's senile. Elara, you know this is some stunt, a performance. You're staging this. What, for sympathy?" He turned to the crowd, arms raised like a bad actor overplaying a scene. "My bride and her grandmother are pulling off a little show for all of you, isn't that right?" He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it aloft like some sort of prize. "She signed this herself," he said. "Full transfer of assets, voluntarily. It's right here." Some guests leaned in. Others looked down, embarrassed for him. One man actually scoffed. I didn't move. Not until the moment required it. Then, slowly, I opened my clutch and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. It had a deep red seal, my attorney's signature on the flap. "I never signed your version," I said, letting my voice stay steady, quiet. "But I did sign this. A revocation of all financial access and authority. Effective this morning." I walked to the head table and laid it down, right beside the bouquet of roses, now wilted at the edges. And then I slipped the ring off my finger. It made a soft sound when it touched the polished wood. It wasn't just metal. It wasn't just a symbol of a wedding gone wrong. It was the last piece of their control over me. The ballroom went utterly still. Dorian stared at the ring like it had slapped him. His mouth opened, then shut, then opened again, but no sound came out. Guests no longer whispered. They watched, waited. Rowena didn't speak again. She didn't need to. My father's face was pale, his lips tight, jaw working as if he might say something, but thought better of it. I looked Dorian in the eyes. "You just lost everything." And I meant every word, not just the money or the marriage, but the mask, the performance, the comfort of a lie so long protected. The crowd began murmuring again, some retreating, some pressing in closer, others picking up phones they'd earlier ignored. I could feel the shift like a current changing course. He was no longer the charming fiancé. He was the man everyone just saw come undone. And as the room erupted in whispers, I wondered, what comes after surviving a night like this? People often say the quiet after a storm is the loudest sound you'll ever hear. And that ballroom, once filled with music, laughter, polished heels tapping rhythmically across marble floors, had become deafening in its silence. Only now it was filled with whispers, pointed fingers, darting eyes, and the occasional clink of crystal as the facade of celebration finally shattered. Within minutes, it was over. Security escorted Dorian out, though he tried to resist, yelling that he'd sue everyone from the caterer to the florist. I didn't look at him again. I didn't need to. Some guests left in a rush, grabbing coats, pretending to be late for early morning flights. Others hovered in clusters, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. I overheard one woman mutter, "He always seemed too slick." Another man whispered, "I thought they looked happy. Guess not." And then there was my father. He stood by the bar, drink untouched, face tight like someone trying to calculate the damage. His eyes met mine briefly, not with guilt, but with something colder, annoyance, as if I had ruined his night. He started to step toward me, maybe to apologize, maybe to deny. I'll never know, because just as his mouth opened, the crowd around him parted. Not for him, but away from him, and I saw it then. His control, so firm for so long, was slipping. No one rushed to his defense, no one laughed at his jokes. The silence around him said what words never could. That night ended not with a bang, but a slow unraveling. And I let it. Days passed. The flowers wilted. The catered leftovers were tossed. My dress hung in my closet like a ghost of someone I barely remembered being. Dallas had turned crisp, autumn finally stretching into the air with a hint of cold that clung to the windows of my home. My home, not ours, not his. I moved through the rooms slowly, like I was relearning the layout of a life that had once belonged to a stranger. The sofa where he used to leave his jacket, the kitchen drawer where I'd once hidden my EpiPen after he accidentally threw it out. Now it was quiet, and not in the painful way, not anymore. I stood at the kitchen table, fingers tracing the wood grain, remembering how he used to mock the way I folded napkins. How he'd once said, "You're cute when you pretend to care about the little things." That's when I remembered it. The napkin. I opened the drawer near the coffee machine, pulling out the white embroidered cloth Rowena had handed me that night. It still smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar. The E was stitched in blue thread, delicate but strong. I unfolded it, smoothing it out on the table like something sacred. And I realized, it wasn't just a napkin. It never was. It was her way of saying, "You still belong. You still matter." I sat down, resting my palms on either side of the cloth. And for the first time in days, I let myself feel it all. The fear, the humiliation, the loss, but also the strength. The undeniable truth that I had survived something most people wouldn't even see coming. People always talk about healing like it's a goal, like there's a finish line you cross and suddenly you're whole again. But that's not real. Not for me. The wound is still there. Maybe it always will be. But I've stopped waiting for it to close before I start living. And that's the difference. Survival, I've learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about refusing to disappear. I took the napkin and hung it over the back of my chair. Not tucked away, but visible. A reminder. A quiet vow. Somewhere behind me, Rowena's soft footsteps approached. She didn't say much. She never did when it really mattered. But before she left the room, she touched my shoulder and whispered, "Next time, Elara. No one decides your worth but you." And I believed her. Because sometimes the family you're born into won't save you. But the strength you claim for yourself can. I stood, looking out the window. The sun had started to rise, barely, just a pale orange line across the edge of the sky. And I walked forward, not with celebration, not with fanfare, but with peace. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.